Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this 11th study circle session of VP Shindre and Associates. Today's topic is a continuation of the part one of the topic confidential information, non-disclosure and non-compete clauses. In the first session, we got a litigator's perspective. And now we will be getting a legal and practical perspective on this topic. I would request everyone to kindly switch off their audio and turn off their video. And just to give a brief background regarding our study circle session, this study circle session was started by Advocate VP Shindre and Advocate Bendre in 1985. And these sessions would be conducted in the men's bar room of the district court premises. Thereafter, carrying the baton forward, these study circle sessions were conducted by Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat and Advocate Pramod Bendre. And now, in this digital age, we have decided to continue this tradition of study circle sessions through Zoom calls and through the digital medium. So with that, I would request my colleague, Shruti Avti, to kindly introduce our esteemed speakers for today. Over to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Kunal sir. Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the 11th study circle session organized by VP Shindre and Associates. So as Kunal sir has already told, our topic is on confidential information, non-disclosure and non-compete clauses in a contract. So this is a legal and a practical perspective. And personally, I'm very obliged to introduce our today's esteemed speakers, Professor Nilima Bhadbade ma'am and Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat ma'am. As I'm an alumni of ILS Law College, Pune, so I got the opportunity to be part of Professor Nilima Bhadbade ma'am's guest lectures. And now I'm very thankful that I got an opportunity. Yes, ma'am.
Can you put your video off? Perhaps there's a slight disturbance in your...
Okay, ma'am. Yes. Yes, so I'm very thankful that I got an opportunity to intern under Vaishali Bhagwat ma'am. So I'm very content today to introduce such eminent speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Nilima Bhadbade ma'am. Professor Nilima Bhadbade practiced actively from 1982 till 1994 in the civil trial and appeal matters relating to contracts, property, and arbitration. Her special skills are drafting of pleadings, contracts, conveyance, and written arguments. Until 2016, she was an associate professor at ILS Law College, Pune. She taught contract law, property law, insurance law, and evidence law from 1985 to 2016. She designed and conducted various workshops about contracting at various law colleges and companies. She delivered various lectures on participant-specific aspects of contract and contracting, evidence, consumer protection laws, and intellectual property laws at National Insurance Company, Yashoda, Indian Railway Institute of Civil Engineering, National Academy of Defense Financial Management, Pune, etc. She has also authored many books on contract law and also edited few editions of Pollock and Mullah's Indian Contract and Specific Relief Act. She has designed and conducted various workshops and also delivered lectures on numerous topics, including contract law. She is also an avid blogger, and her blogs can be found on her website, that's www.arbiterdicta.in. She's been trained at Cardiff Law School, Cardiff, Wales, in a program under the auspices of British Council. I welcome you, ma'am. Our second speaker is Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat. Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat is amongst the first technology lawyers in the country with an experience over 20 years as a practicing lawyer. She heads a 50-year-old all-service law firm, VP Shindre and Associates, which was started by her father, Advocate VP Shindre. Advocate Bhagwat is a TCS Shivning Scholar on Cyber Policy and Cyber Defense and has earned the post-graduation certification from Cranfield University, UK. She is a practicing civil and cyber lawyer, and her work includes litigation support, litigation, non-litigation, and advisory practice. She practices in a civil court, district courts, Bombay High Court, and tribunals such as NCLT, DRT, TDSAT, and adjudicating officer in cyber. Her work also focuses on violence against women and children in cyberspace. In the non-litigation and advisory practice, Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat is a legal advisor, retainer to several MSMEs and corporates in manufacturing, banking, fintech, media and entertainment, healthcare, IT, and ITES, and the educational sector as well. Her non-litigation work also includes assisting in legal and regulatory compliance, documentation of policies and contracts, vetting and review of contracts, negotiating contracts, conflict management, and dispute resolution, and also strategic advice in managing the legal issues. She has won several recognitions and awards for her pro bono work. So I welcome our today's esteemed speakers on behalf of everyone. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti, for that introduction. So before the session, we were just discussing that, introduction is taking some time, but considering the body of work of our speakers, we thought that, even if it's a slightly longer introduction, that should be fine. So with that, I request Neelima ma'am and Vaishali ma'am to kindly take over with the presentation. Thank you.
Over to Nilima, ma'am.
Yes, yes. I hope the view is okay, Kunal. I am
Yes,
learning
ma'am.
Zoom. Yes, I'm learning Zoom. A very good morning to you all. And it's a pleasure to be in the study circle of advocates, especially young advocates. Frankly, an academician like me does not fit very well among advocates. My advocate friends tell me that I live in an ivory tower. And I say, well, there are so many aspects which, as an academician, I'm able to see. Perhaps they may not be of practical importance, but they are important to know. So it is with this disclaimer that I begin, that I have never drafted a confidentiality agreement. But I have read a lot about it, especially because this is an area which is a challenge for contract remedies. And therefore, with this background, let me begin today's session. We had a very wonderful earlier session about legal aspects, and I'm building on that background. I will not cover those again. We saw what is confidential information. We saw what are the remedies and how it is protected. And since we know that, we are now able to look at the confidentiality agreement itself. Frankly, wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. And wherever there is a remedy, parties who make contracts have to design their provisions in the contract with an eye on remedies. Once they make an agreement, what they agree, if it is fulfilled, they have no need to go to contract law. And I believe that the contract law is not about telling everybody how to contract, but it is about providing remedies. It is about enforcement. So if a contract falls through, the law applies to enforce it. And therefore, how it will get enforced, on that depends how parties will make provisions in their contract. And therefore, whenever we look at the provisions of confidentiality agreements, which I'm going to consider today, we have to keep in our mind the remedies that are available. I must also stress the importance of what I call remedies within the contract. Build the contract in such a way that each party will have a good perspective of what the other is likely to do, and a good control over what the other party will do. And that can be built within the contract itself. The law is not necessary. To give you an example, whether if I am delivering goods to you and you are going to make payment, whether I deliver goods to you first and then you will make the payment, or whether I will take an advance first, then deliver, then you will give me a post-dated check, or whether I will first give you a bank guarantee, then you will give me advance, then I will deliver, and then you will give me letters of credit. We are building our transaction on the basis, or rather in order to cover the risk. And if everything goes forward, perhaps this risk handling mechanism has worked really well. It is with this background again that we are going to look at the clauses. I have made my presentation very simple, and so let us get forward to it. Our session today is divided into two parts. I will be dealing with the contents of a confidentiality agreement, a discussion about it, and a brief overview of non-solicitation agreement. And then Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat will deal with the making of policies, the measures which parties must take in-house in order to protect confidentiality. So let us begin. As regards question, please keep posting them on chat. If they deal with what is already covered, I will deal them at that time. And all the other questions, I will take them in the end. Yes, good. The presentation is working. In our session today, we will cover these aspects of confidentiality agreements. One is what is confidential information, which is the subject matter of the contract. What is the legal protection given to it? So I will discuss a little bit about Section 27, the confidentiality agreement itself, different aspects of that agreement. Within those aspects, what are the options which parties have? A very brief discussion about non-compete agreements, and a slightly more discussion about non-solicitation agreements. The whole protection is about information. And information is something that exists. It is not promises. And these are some examples of information which will be the subject matter of the confidentiality agreement. Data, for example, a list of customers, drawings, processes, information about layout of premises. I remember one very esteemed lecturer coming from our college long ago, when intellectual property law was fashionable, it was new. And he described that when he visited certain premises abroad for the purposes of discussing a technology transfer agreement, he represented the government. He had to sign at the door a NDA, which said that he will not even disclose what he saw inside the premises, where is the canteen, what was offered in the canteen, and so on. So he said, once I enter the door, whatever I see inside is built within my brain. And I gave an undertaking that I will not be disclosing that also, right? Whether it's correct, whether it's fair is another matter. But that is the level to which parties may insist upon confidentiality. Technical know-how, customers' details, and so on. The list is a long one, but I've taken these as examples. So this is information. And this information, we all know, either can be kept secret or it will come out in the open. For example, if I have customers' detail, anyone can sit outside my door and ask people who enter, please give me your name. And if he is obliged, if people are obliged enough, he will collect the customers' names. So it's not that who visits my office or who visits my shop is secret, but the list has got a value. And that list is something which I do not wish to divulge. That is the list of all the customers who visit. Let me deal a little bit about intellectual property and information. And intellectual property protection is necessary because I believe, and people don't like to hear this, that there is always a right to copy unless it is restricted, right? What is the harm in copying? If you write something and I take it and publish it, what is the harm? To protect this, to protect the commercial interest in it, we have the intellectual property laws. Now, as regards copyright, copyright is also important to decide not to publish. So if I enjoy copyright, I will just keep it with me and not allow anyone to publish. But nevertheless, if I hand it over to someone, that person will read it. So there is a right to copy unless restricted. And if you look at the intellectual property laws, then you will realize that they recognize that something is property and will protect it if somebody encroaches upon it. So what does IP protect? Each intellectual property law gives a different kind of protection. Basically, it excludes others. And from what? That is important. Because copyright law gives an exclusive right to copy, publish, and communicate. It's given in many more, the rights are described in many more words, but essentially these three things. It means that if I have, for example, a recipe, and I've written it down beautifully with a picture, and I send it to you, you can't make a copy of my expression of that recipe. But I cannot prevent under copyright law from you using it or making that recipe and taking photographs and describe it the way you have done it. Okay. So if I want to prevent that, then I have to put in an additional protection, which is in the nature of an agreement of confidentiality. So I will say I'm giving you this recipe and you are not going to use it except for the purpose for which it is given. So copyright law protects me from your copying it. But if I can't stop you from using. If I have to do that, then it will have to be contractual. IP rights are essentially private rights and they are limited in time. It's 60 plus in copyright, 20 in patent. Trademark is of course perpetual. Design is 10 plus 5. And after that, whatever is that property, it's the invention, it is the work that is available to the world. And what we again remember is that if something is property, the law cannot protect it unless it is visible. What does it mean? It is identifiable. Why is that necessary? That is necessary because if you want to stop somebody or punish somebody or have remedies against somebody who infringes it, then he should be able to know what it is and it belongs to somebody. And the person alleging it is mine must be able to show this is mine and that is violated. So we say, this is my property and he has taken it away, so it is trespass. So what is this which is violated? And that is why they say copyright, it is the work, but it should be on a tangible medium so that you can show that it is yours. In patents, it is the description given in the specification. It is the invention given in the specification. And if that is violated, you can identify. This fence is necessary. And therefore, you can't put a fence around abstract ideas, right? Because ideas or something which is here, something which you have thought about, which you have spoken, right? There is no copyright, there is no intellectual property. But how to protect it if it is done? Then you have to come under contract and then say there is a confidentiality agreement. It becomes necessary when you want to progress beyond what is property, then that will need protection under contract law. Now, an intellectual property rights do not exist in data. So just a collection of names, there is no intellectual property right. Just a collection of telephone numbers. And there was always inquiries, you know, when I was in college, there were always people wanting to know the entire data of students of our college for various purposes. So that is just a list and copyright law doesn't protect. The data protection law will protect it. Then there is no intellectual property right in facts. So if I have developed a technology that is a fact, and there is no intellectual property in it unless I apply for a patent and get a patent. There is no intellectual property in ideas. So I have an idea, a storyline, which I narrate orally to somebody. If I write it down, there is copyright, but I narrate orally to somebody. There is no copyright, there is no IP. So I will have to protect it with a confidentiality agreement. Now, because I think the cursor is visible, good. So this limited in time, because they are all limited in time, if I want to protect my, I will say, information permanently, then the only thing I can do is to keep it secret. In today's world, it is very difficult to keep secret which you have brought out. But Coca-Cola has been able to keep its formula secret despite all that. So either you keep secret or you make it known to the world, fulfill the IP requirements and get the protection under the legal regime. If you want to keep it secret and you want somebody else to keep it secret, then have a contract with that person. So when we talk of confidentiality agreements, we are actually operating in this background. So what are the situations in which we are required to preserve confidentiality? And by confidentiality, I mean, if I keep secret and I keep it to myself and in the cupboard, I don't need anything. But if I want to give it to somebody and yet keep it secret, then these are the situations. Employment, an employee knows everything about the employer and he can always hand it over to a competitor. He may hand it over to somebody who will be able to deal in the shares of that company. M&A, that is mergers and acquisitions, buying businesses, selling or licensing of technical know-how, in research, consultancy. So I wish to know more about the invention that I am making. So I have to engage a consultant to look at it and give me feedback, right? The situation requires that my consultant should keep it secret. Similarly to lawyers, but for lawyers, there is another branch, or rather there is an implied obligation of confidentiality. It is worth one full discussion, and perhaps we may deal with it later. Then while creating our intellectual property, it becomes necessary to have confidentiality agreements. For example, between a publisher and an author, including the fact that this author has approached the publisher for the purposes of publishing a book. The fact that they are having a contract itself is to be kept confidential. However, one of the requirements of patents is that something which is already known, you can't apply for a patent. Or rather, if you apply, it will not be granted. And let us imagine that I am developing a new solution for tires, vehicle tires. And the only way I can find out whether this works or not is to put it on trial on 15 vehicles of people and then test it and get their feedback and so on. Which means now I am making available what is my invention to these members of the public. Now I must therefore have a confidentiality arrangement with them that this is for the purpose of patent and they are not to disclose anything, including the fact that it is being tested. So while preparing these inventions, which are intended to be patentable, one has to be very conscious about confidentiality arrangements so that it should never be said that this invention has been published. I must tell you, I have a niece and she did an internship with Google. And whenever we asked her, and she was also employed for a while with Google, and whenever we asked her, what do you do at Google? She would say, I have an agreement. I will not disclose. But you tell us what you do. Do you do software? Do you do meeting people? Do you do marketing? What is it that you do at Google? She said, I have an agreement. I'm not going to tell. I was very happy that she was conscious of the agreement and she was not telling even to her mother. But that is the level to which Google wishes to maintain confidentiality. Then the next item is, of course, professional lawyers, doctors, and bankers. And frankly, I believe that whatever clients tell lawyers is so confidential that lawyers must have a good confidentiality maintenance policy in their offices. But that we can keep for some other time. Now, to all this, the contract law applies. So what part of contract law applies to it? One is formation. It should be properly formed. Among business houses, there will rarely be an issue relating to formation. But what is important is we see whether all the terms which are offered by one party are actually agreed by the other party or not. So we have to go through the offer acceptance analysis Otherwise, it will be a signed a document about which there will not be any dispute. Now, it may be a full agreement like an NDA, devoted only for maintaining confidentiality, or it may be a clause or a group of clauses or provisions in a larger agreement. The principal provision which applies to 37, and this is my very favorite provision in the Contract Act, and we rarely pay attention to it. What is it? Parties must perform their respective obligations unless it is dispensed with or excused. Parties must perform or offer to perform their respective obligations. And that actually is the heart, the principal provision of contract law. Contract law doesn't tell you what you should contract, but it tells you if you have contracted something, abide by it. And therefore, whatever we wish to get out of that contract, it can be provided within it, right? Then our agreement, because it encroaches into the territory of restraint of trade, must steer clear of section 27, which is about restraint of trade. And the contract law provides for remedies, and the remedy of compensation and the remedy of liquidated damages. We also have the specific relief act, which deals with specific performance and injunction, which will apply to confidentiality agreements. A little bit about restraint of trade. You all know the law. It was dealt with in detail in the earlier session, but I'm just going to fly over it. Under section 27, an agreement which restrains anyone from following a business, profession, etc. I'm sorry, I don't know it by heart. Well, to that extent, it is void. And if it is a full restraint, it is void, but even if it is a partial restraint, it is void under section 27. Now, over the years, it has been held time and again that restraints which exist during the term of the contract, section 27 doesn't apply to them at all. So the courts don't say that they are not restraints. They say 27 doesn't apply. So for example, if I agree with my employer that I will not work for anybody else while I am in your employment, 27 doesn't apply to it at all. The reasons are discussed in those judgments. You can read them. But if I agree that after I leave your service, I will not join a competitor for 3 months, small time, this part is void. Of course, I can agree. Of course, I can abide by it. But if I don't, my employer cannot file or claim anything against me as damages or file an injunction or get an injunction against me, because this part is void. This is where the Indian law, all those countries where the Indian Contract Act applies, and California, this is the law. This applies not just in employment, but the Gujarat Bottling Company Limited versus Coca-Cola Company, decided by the Supreme Court in 1995, held that it applies to other arrangements as well. Therefore, if a dealer of vehicles, if a manufacturer of vehicles has appointed a dealer, and the dealer agrees that so long as I am dealing in your vehicles, I will not deal in other vehicles, either myself or as partner or as director of any other company. And after our agreement ends in whichever way, I will not deal with vehicles of any other company for a period of 6 months. This is not employment. Here, the part which says while I am dealing in your cars, I will not deal with anybody is valid. But the part which says after our termination of our contract, I will not deal with anybody's vehicles, this part is void. So pre-contract restraint does not attract 27. But in any case, if injunction is sought, then injunction is a discretionary remedy. And as a part of that discretion, and of course the remedy being equitable, courts find out whether the restraint is reasonable or not. So the balancing of interests this is what case law will indicate, that whenever injunction is sought, the first question is, does it violate 27? If it does, there is no remedy. But even if it doesn't violate 27, the courts may still go into the facts of each case and see whether the restraint is reasonable. And in doing so, we'll look at the interest of the person, the employer, and the interest of the employee. Now, this restraint of trade has this exception. It was, of course, discussed, but I'm going to the exception today. So let me see if we have Shruti. Can you please read this exception, Shruti? Very well, I will read it. I think.
Ma'am, I think there's a block which is appearing on the screen. So there's some gray block
Yes,
that
I
like near your
opened. Yeah.
Okay.
Is Shruti able to read, or shall I read it?
Fine. Otherwise, ma'am, I can read it out if that's okay.
Yes, please. It is a
So
change
the
of voice
exception-
for everybody, that's all.
So exception, section 27, restraint of trade, exception 1, saving of agreement not to carry on business of which goodwill is sold. One who sells the goodwill of a business may agree. Ma'am, that block is there.
Yes, I'll remove it. Just a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that better?
It's still there. No, it's still there, that block.
Yeah.
Now I can see it. So one who sells the goodwill of a business may agree with the buyer to refrain from carrying on a similar business within specified limits, so long as the buyer or any person deriving title to the goodwill from him carries on a like business therein, provided that such limits appear to the court reasonable, regard being had to the nature of the business.
Yes, thank you. When somebody reads, it helps my voice. So thank you, Kunal. So when a business is being sold, and the important part is it is sold with goodwill. So mergers and acquisitions will come here. Taking over of a partnership firm will come here. A person selling his business away to somebody else will come in this. Provided it is sold with goodwill, then the seller of the business may agree with the buyer of the business. Remember, there has to be an agreement. This doesn't automatically apply. So both the parties should have agreed that the seller will not carry on a similar business. So there has to be a contract within, perhaps it will be within the buying and selling contract. It will be a clause in that contract that the seller will not carry on business so long as, Mr. Buyer, you are doing that business, or so long as somebody deriving title from you. So if you sell the business to somebody to X, then so long as X is doing that business. We must remember that if the business stops, then this clause exception will stop operating. So the business running and either through the buyer or through somebody else is essential. So long as the buyer or the person deriving title carries on a like business where the local limits should be specified and there has to be a time. So within those local limits, so what should be those local limits? When will they be reasonable? Because the court should consider reasonable. So if the seller has, let us say, a goodwill or customers or clientele in Maharashtra, then naturally, if he says, I will not do business in Maharashtra, it is reasonable. But if his business itself is located in Pune and saying that I will not do business in India, then he can start business in, say, Mumbai. And if the buyer files a suit against him, he can say that this restriction is not reasonable. So what I wish to stress is that this exception doesn't operate automatically. There has to be a contract that this business will operate. Yeah, yes, good. So this contract is essential and this will apply whichever entity is buying or selling business. You find similar exceptions. Yes, it's moved. I'm sorry, I look at my side because I can see the slides moving on my mobile phone. There are other exceptions which you find in the Partnership Act. While the partnership is in force, doing business, partners have to agree. So it has to be within the partnership agreement that none of them will carry on any other business, or a partner X will not carry on any other business. And this is not subject to the requirement of reasonableness at all. And I compare it with this pre-contract or during the contract restriction, which we find in section 27. And then in the other three, which I have mentioned, it is restrictions are permissible if they are reasonable as regards geographical limits and time. One is an outgoing partner who is retiring may agree that he will not do business. If the firm is being dissolved, then partners may agree that they will not do business, or a particular partner will not do that business. And after dissolution, partners may agree with the buyer of the business in a similar manner. And the last three are subject to reasonableness of restrictions. Right? Now, it is under section 27, the whole purpose of restraint of trade in many cases. One is where goodwill is being protected. Somebody has paid for the goodwill, so he wishes to extract profits for what he has invested. But the other reason or purpose of restraint of trade is often to prevent a person from carrying with him confidential information to the competitor. So what he does shouldn't benefit the competitor. So if there is just a statement which says you will not work for somebody after termination, this is considered restraint of trade. But if it is built into confidentiality and the position of the employer is indeed of confidence, he does have access to confidential information, then such a clause, it is possible that under such a clause, an injunction might be granted. These are so fact specific, but I think if the idea is to protect confidential information, and the clause also which restricts a person from joining another person after termination of employment is reasonable, then the two together might yield, or one might be able to get an injunction on that basis if it is shown that the whole purpose of it is to protect confidential information. But there is one aspect. Now let us suppose that I am working with you and I naturally gain expertise in whatever is your business, in whatever product you make. Now I have gained my skill. I cannot be prevented from using my skill. I can be prevented from giving information about you, but you can't prevent me from working my skill elsewhere. So let us suppose that you are developing a software in which I have gained a certain skill, and you are dealing in the share market. That is your business. Now let us suppose that I join another business which is about education, where the same skill I am using. So the programming features, pardon me, I do not know technology. Please understand the words I use as if I am in the KG relating to technology. But whatever programs I have developed and which is the skill, if I'm able to apply it for the purposes of education software with somebody, then I'm using my skills, but I'm not using confidential information. So much depends on how these facts are brought before the court. Now, this is one aspect which we must remember, that although contract law gives remedies and property law also gives remedies, what is property law all about? It is about conferring good title so that the title holder can enforce his title. That is the whole purpose of property law. So although the law says that if you have land and somebody trespasses, the law will help you. If you have a house and somebody trespasses, the police will help you. You have remedies and so on. The best method that this shouldn't happen is to put a fence around the land or to put a lock on the house so that the occasion of trespass does not occur. And I will apply the same to confidential information. It is very important that even though I am giving you confidential information with me, and I do not wish my confidential information to get out, especially through my employees, I should be having fences and locks in my own establishment, policies, method of security, and my employees should be responsible enough to understand that they have to maintain confidentiality. The other thing I will do is I will only selectively disclose. So just as if I have a house, I will select who should come and stay in it if I'm giving on license. Similarly, when I am disclosing, I should disclose only that much which is necessary, not the whole of it, especially if I am say looking out for finance. Then I should first disclose the broad background and so on. And perhaps I may not be required to give technical details of the invention which I am making. So I can be selective in the way I disclose. And it is these aspects which I have requested Vaishali Bhagwat Madam, and she will deal with it effectively as to what should be the policies relating to confidential information, relating to security, and how employees are to be made aware of their responsibility. If this is strong, then the information can be protected very well. So how to protect it via a confidentiality agreement? Well, everything depends on what you agree. So it is very important to look at what you agree. Let me take the example of sale of goods, sale of products. So we all will take great care to see what will be the description of goods. So we will see what will be the description of confidential information. We will see how it is to be delivered and where it is to be delivered and who will deliver it. Similarly with confidential information. We will see whether there will be a warranty of effects and a warranty of fitness of purpose, whether these goods will be useful to you or not. Similarly, there can be a warranty for whether the confidential information is accurate, it is complete, and whether it will be fit for the purposes of the person who is receiving it. So just as we have these aspects in any other transaction, we should be able to think of all of them when we are dealing with confidentiality. And whether to have a sketchy small agreement where I simply write to you, will you buy my goods? This is the quotation, and you say yes, right? Probably a one-page agreement is good enough. And sometimes for example, when companies buy products through suppliers, they have a very detailed 10, 15-page agreement. So whether it should be sketchy or it should be comprehensive, we should be able to understand when it should be so. There may be occasions where it can be a small, simple agreement, but there may be occasions which go into great details. What we will see is certain details which we should look out for. I am not going to tell what is good, which clause is good. I'm only going to make us ourselves aware of what are going to be those aspects. The main essential things in a confidential agreement, the must-be's are, first of all, which information is confidential must be stated. Then the use for which it will be put must be stated. We do not do that in goods, right? We don't say these goods which you buy must be used for the purpose. No, but this is what we will have here. And how will this disclosure be restricted? So will you be able to disclose to your advisors? How much will you disclose to your employees and so on? So these three things are the essential things. So let us look at the other things also. The first part is, of course, the parties. They may be called giver, discloser, giving party. And when I went through so many templates on the internet, so many other terminology has been used. I prefer giver and receiver because it is easy to type and it is also easy to understand. There could be a receiver, a recipient, or a receiving party. But very often other parties are involved in all this handling of confidential information. They could be employees of the receiving party. They could be advisors and consultants. There could be many more people to whom it becomes necessary to disclose. And the question arises, what if those third parties will disclose either according to agreement or violating unauthorizedly? Who will be liable for that? This is like asking, will the contractor be liable for the defects which the subcontractor has caused in the works? Right? So whose liability will it be if the people to whom it is disclosed unauthorizedly violate it? So this is an aspect which has to be dealt with, or which can be. I will not say has to be, because whether you deal with it or not depends on each case and differently for each case. So very quickly, this is what we are going to see. And let me see, let us suppose our time is okay. I think I will send these slides. I'll go directly to those aspects. First is confidential information. We have seen what is confidential information. It can be so many things. But I have given here 3 types in which it can be stating what is confidential information. All information that the giver will supply to the receiver, whether oral, electronic, written, or otherwise, whether or not it is identified as such at the time of disclosure. This sounds very nice, but it is too general. And if I am a receiver, I will have a problem, because there are bound to be so much information which is not really confidential and which actually can be disclosed. And if I am the giver, even for me, there is a problem, because I might say you have disclosed this, and then it turns out that it is not of a confidential nature. That is one. And the other is, there is a problem with oral disclosure, how to prove that it was disclosed. So should there also be, that is something I've not covered later, so I will talk about it. If oral information also is to be made confidential, then can there be a sort of a routine that once that information is given, it will be followed up in writing and acknowledged by the other party? So this routine will, the details may not be given, but we have disclosed to you the process in which this is to be done on such and such date, right? And the other party says, yes, we have received it. Then that becomes a record that the disclosure is made orally. So as regards oral disclosures, there's always a problem to prove that it was disclosed, or the other party, whether it was received or not. The other one is like this: any information, any form or medium made that the giver supplies to the receiver, which is marked confidential. I have sort of crunched many clauses to make them simple for my presentation. It means that every time the giver sends the material, he will say confidential on top of it. So he will have lots of stamps which will be stamped and so on. Electronic stamps also may be available, and that will be confidential. It means that the discloser now has a big responsibility of ensuring that whatever goes out and is confidential nature is marked as confidential. And as a receiver, there's a problem that there may be so much communication which is not really of a confidential nature, but which is marked as confidential. So both parties therefore have, while this is being done, this is a very good idea of a clause. While this is being done, both parties should be conscious of what should be marked and what should not be marked. Very often the confidential information is described as a long list of processes, inventions, very long list of 100 items. And if they are there, that's very good. But we all know, as a matter of interpretation of contracts, that the longer the list, then anything which is not in it is considered to be excluded. So we will have to draft it in such a way that it will also include things which are not part of the list. So what to choose in which occasion is a question to be decided by the parties. Moreover, I would say that if I have received a draft from you of a confidentiality agreement or clause, I must look at this aspect and see whether I will be able to fulfill it or not as a receiver of confidential information. Now, a confidentiality agreement must also cover, and this is what I believe, exceptions. And there being exceptions in the agreement, this is in the interest of the receiver. So usually the exceptions will be about these, that those which are already known to the receiver. After all, very often the giver and the receiver are in the same business, in the same specialty in the business. So it is quite likely that the level of knowledge, or what we call the state of art, or the field in which they operate, their knowledge and information is matches. So let us suppose that you are the giver and you give me information which is confidential, and I find that it is already with me, right? Then I already have it. So the only question will arise that if you start saying this was confidential which I gave, I should be able to prove that I have it already with me. So this is the problem in having such clause, or why we have this clause. The next is where matter is already in public domain. The third is where the receiver has received it from a third party. So if I am developing a product where I'm also getting information from you as well as from a third party for the purposes of developing the product, then if I've got it from third party, it may so happen that what you give me is also the same. So if I've got it from third party, then I should not be liable to you for unauthorized disclosure, where it is independently developed by the receiver. and permissible disclosures like to lawyers, consultants, accountants, etc. Now, very often it may require further conditions in appropriate cases that if I say that if it's already known to me, then please exclude it. And you are the giver, then you will want to say that, okay, if it is already with you, then the moment we give you, within 10 days, you must inform us with documents that it is already with you. And within specified time, say 10 days. And the other condition very often, especially with the last one, permissible disclosures, is that the disclosure must be only to the extent that is required for that engagement, nothing more than that. Please go through many confidentiality clauses, they are available on the internet. Please go through these aspects, and as we read, we will appreciate why each one is done in a certain way. Now, the next point is purpose of the supply. Look at the first example. The last two are examples. I have crunched them for the purposes of our presentation. One is which says that this is information is being given to you, and I read, to enable to evaluate business opportunities in the future. Means the giver is giving it to the receiver so that the receiver would want to know whether he wishes to do business with the giver or not. And then this becomes too general, and the receiver may apply it for some other purpose, because business opportunities could mean anything. And look at the next one. It is only the purpose of deciding whether to purchase the business of and not for any other purpose. So it is very important to limit the purpose for the purposes of giving confidential information. Then how long should this obligation exist? This term should be reasonable. It will be a rare occasion where it has to be permanent. It should be as short as may be necessary. So if the whole idea of confidentiality is that there will be a business deal where the supplier will supply, and this supply contract is for 2 years, and after that maybe new machine will get developed, so another 1 or 2 years after that. So it will be 2 years after the whole contract is over. So I think it's necessary to anticipate that period and put a reasonable period. And it's also important to say that such terms, such obligation will survive the contract, especially in terms of employment. Oh, a spelling mistake there. What are the obligations of the recipients? Let us look at them. The first is, and it should be given in the contract, that the receiver must take reasonable measures to keep information confidential. He must prevent unauthorized access. So he should take steps. For example, if it is a drawing and we are in the physical world, he must keep it in the safe. This is preventing unauthorized access. And he must not disclose it to third parties except as permitted under the contract. So these three elements should be found in the confidentiality agreement. Now, what measures must he take? Let me go back again. Reasonable measures. Sometimes it is absolute. Should it be absolute? And this is an example of an absolute agreement. The receiver shall ensure that the information disclosed to the receiver shall be kept confidential and shall not be disclosed except as permitted in this agreement. This is absolute. And we all know that it is impossible to keep it absolute. It can never be guaranteed. There are so many employees, so many people, that there is bound to be some leakage in that information. And if you have this clause, it indicates that the receiver will be liable even if he takes precautions. That is the language of the clause. So a receiver should be cautious that at least if he has taken precautions, he should not be liable. This should be his liability. So we say take reasonable steps. So the receiver should take reasonable steps. This is the next level. In which case there is no liabilities if his steps are reasonable, right? There are many people who are not even aware that if they have 3 employees, they should restrict internet access of those computers on which they are working. They think they don't know what is reasonable. So if I am a receiver and I have agreed to take reasonable steps, I should be clear what is reasonable for the purposes of fulfilling this obligation. And it also means that if precautions are taken, then the person will not be liable. And I have requested Vaishali Madam to talk about what are these reasonable steps. And sometimes it will be that the receiver should take the same amount of care as the receiver would take of his own information. Clauses will be much longer. I'm just taken that part which is essential. So this means that the giver should first find out how the receiver takes care. We all know that the element of care that must be taken keeps changing, especially in the way in which our electronic environment is changing. So what is reasonable is bound to differ from time to time. So if while I take care of my system in a certain way, the other party may expect that I should take something more, but I'm not taking it. So if this is the type of clause, a very good clause, but then the giver must be very clear about the care which the receiver takes. So an obligation on the giver to first verify what the receiver is taking. And again, Vaishali madam will deal with this aspect. Then the next obligation is to be responsible for unauthorized disclosure. Many books which I read for the purpose of this lecture, they indicate that this should not be kept implied. Let it be expressly given. Why? Because when the receiver gives it to XYZ, permitted disclosures, those people are likely to give it away or not take precautions. So what this does is that even if those third parties to whom permitted disclosure is made, third parties means connected with the receiver, if they allow unauthorized use, then the receiver should be responsible for it. Now, if you're a receiver, you will say, why should I be responsible? But such clauses have a meaning. When the receiver is responsible, he will take care of the information while giving it to the third parties, permitted disclosures. It puts the risk on him, and therefore he should be taking more care of it. It is like saying, Mr. Contractor, you can engage a subcontractor, but whatever defects happen when the subcontractor works, you are going to be liable. This is actually the position of contract law, but in confidentiality agreement, it's very good to put it expressly in the document. Yeah. Then his responsibility can be to indemnify for breach. If I am a receiver, I would not like to give an indemnity. If you are the giver, you would want a very wide indemnity. What is indemnity? Whatever is loss is caused, right? That will be paid. And section 73 of contemplation, mitigation, was it within the knowledge of parties, etc., doesn't apply. Calculate the loss and every paisa can be recovered. This is indemnity. So a giver would want it like this. The receiver shall indemnify and hold harmless the giver against all damages, expenses, costs, losses which the giver suffers because of unauthorized use or disclosure of the confidential information. A very wide indemnity. As a receiver, I would not like to do that, simply because I am aware that I cannot fully control access, use. So I would like to put in this, what losses are covered? Will there be only direct losses that will be covered, or indirect and consequential will not be covered or will be covered? Will it cover only actions of the receiver or will it cover actions of the third parties? If it's only receiver, accordingly, I will reframe the clause. And I will definitely like to limit the amount, not liquidated damages, limit. Means I will be liable, but not more than the price of the whole contract, or not more than 50 lakh rupees, or not more than 5 lakh rupees. So I would like to limit the amount. Then this is again suggested in many books that it is good if the receiver acknowledges that this unauthorized disclosure will cause irreparable loss to the giver. This is the truth, but let it come from the mouth of the receiver. Why? If it is stated like this, then he cannot later on easily say that the loss is repairable, don't grant injunction. So it aids in granting of injunction. And the second is that in the way in which liquidated damages law has developed in India, and the discussion which the Supreme Court has made in a number of cases, stating that if the loss is not ascertainable, then only the liquidated damages will be paid, right? If you all wish to read more about how this is actually made complex, just visit my website, Obiter Dicta, and just give a search on liquidated damages Nilima Bhadbadi. You'll come to a small speech I gave once upon a time. I couldn't develop it into a longer article, but that actually tells us how contracting parties will now think if they wish to draft a liquidated damages clause. So for that purpose in Indian law, it might help to say that loss caused will be repairable if at all we are putting a liquidated damages clause in our contract. Now, this is not an
Maybe we can,
obligation.
like
Yes.
on a WhatsApp group, we can share a link to that.
Oh yes, I'll send it.
article that
I'll
you
send
just
it. I'll send it to you.
Yes.
This is not an obligation, but while we are on the topic, I'm just talking about it, that if there is a liquidated damages clause, which I found in some drafts, which I studied, we must know that if you put liquidated damages clause, then it might affect the grant of injunction. But sometimes injunction is useless if the information is already out. And in that case, liquidated damages plus this irreparable loss statement ought to be useful. Then another obligation on the recipient. There is nothing more to state except this, that whenever you come to know of the breach, you must immediately inform us, inform the giver. The next is return the information. How to get that returned? Will it be physical copies? Should they actually be returned? Is a matter of detail. So whenever we demand, there is a last slide, but I will state it just now, that the giver must always be in control of the confidential information. And so whenever I demand, you must give it back, add or destroy, and certify to us that you have destroyed it. So this is one more obligation. Kunal, I think our session will get extended. I hope that is fine. Otherwise, I will
Yes,
have to rush through. Yeah.
No, ma'am, so we can extend it by half an hour. Should not be.
Okay.
If required.
Yeah. Then the non-solicitation and a time for it, that the receiver will not entice away or hire. In an appropriate situation where it is between business and business, this may be necessary. Now, there are other aspects. One is, especially in case of a sale of business, the question may arise that if I am a giver and I am discussing confidential information with you because I wish to give you some technology or a business opportunity, you may want that I should not be discussing it with somebody else for a period, 1 month, when we are negotiating. Now, it's possible to put that in this statement. Remember, if the receiver is in a bargaining position, the receiver may think of this exclusivity. How to draft that clause, you will find in many templates which are available on the internet. The giver will not talk to anyone else while talking with the receiver. So this is the exclusivity. Then the giver is not prevented from disclosing to anyone else. This is what a giver would want, that I am disclosing my technology to you, but that doesn't prevent me from discussing it with somebody else. So if this is what the giver wants, then he can put that into the document. Then the giver can always say that there is no obligation on me to disclose. So at any moment, I should be able to say that I am not going to disclose fully or a part of it and so on, and this will not amount to breach of our agreement. As I said, the giver must always be in control of the information. Then a clause which says that supplying you the confidential information while we are negotiating does not amount to an offer that we will be doing business with you. I think these clauses are actually used. This is actually being too meticulous, but sometimes it works. Then will there be a warranty about accuracy or completeness? If I am a giver, I don't want to give it. If you are a receiver, you will want it. And if there is going to be a later transaction, then actually detailed warranties can follow in a later transaction rather than put them in the initial pre-negotiation confidentiality agreement. So warranty means when I give you information, say technology or say information of customers, I warrant you, I promise you that it is accurate. So if I say X customer has this telephone number, I am telling you that this is accurate. Excuse me. So warranty. then you would like me to say, if I'm a giver and you are the receiver, you would like me to say that the information which I'm giving you, the technology, the invention which I'm giving you does not violate third parties' intellectual property rights. And if that is the case, then you will want an indemnity from me that if it violates intellectual property rights of anybody else, then I will indemnify you. Then a statement, this is by both, which says that handing over confidential information is not intended to be a transfer, nor is it a license to use. We are just discussing it. So the giver reserves the right to himself in the confidential information. The receiver acknowledges that all rights remain with the giver, and the disclosure does not create license or transfer of any right or property. So the giver must always be in control of the situation. So this is about confidential information. There are only few more slides I'll cover, and if there are questions, I will take them. In non-compete, usually found in employment agreements, also in business transactions, that after the termination of our engagement, whatever contract or employment, I will not compete or join a competitor or be a partner or be a director and so on. Now, the whole law balances two interests. One is protect the information, which they say is the proprietary information of the person, employer, and the personal freedom of individuals, including companies, to do business. And the law is, to a lot of extent, protective of the personal freedom. And therefore, post-contract restrictions are void. Now, in the contracting session, which we are doing just now, I think it is important to pay attention to the language of these clauses. And I will just take one example. In superintendent's company's case, which I have given here, the non-compete applied if the person left service. And the question arose that if his services were terminated, will this clause apply? And the court held that leaving service means only when he leaves the service voluntarily. Now, even if you say if on being terminated, on termination of services, it is likely that most of us understand termination as termination by one party. We can use the word ending of service in any manner. We can use the word determination or coming to an end in any manner, or termination in any manner, whether at the end of the term or by either party. We can always be more clear. So whether it is this or whether it is what is it that he doesn't compete, I think a lot depends on the language that we use for the non-compete agreement. Now I come to non-solicit very quickly. The definition is very simple. Non-solicitation is one under which a party is prohibited from soliciting the other's clients, customers, employees during the term of the agreement. Now, in employment, it applies to the employee when he leaves the company. It can also apply in partnerships, collaborations, franchises, agencies, and distributorship agreements, and so on. What is important is the language used. Not entice is different from not solicit, is different from not hire. So if you and I have an agreement, and I have X, Y, and Z as employees, and our language says that you will not hire my employees, it means that you cannot take X, Y, and Z. If the word used is not solicit, it means that X, who is my employee, can apply to you directly. You promise him a job, then he leaves my company and joins you. You have not solicited, he has approached you. So the language is going to matter. Now let me quickly come to Wipro Limited, not a detailed discussion, which held that it was about a post-termination restraint. And there was a general advertisement of positions, and the court held that this does not amount to solicitation. So advertising among employees of that company is also not. And unsolicited applications of employees, so employees directly apply, right? They are not asked. They can be considered, and it does not violate the non-solicit. So the other thing which the case indicates is that the employers may be barred by that agreement under the non-solicit, but it does not bar the employees from applying for the job. So their right to apply for the job stands protected. This is my last slide. In this case, F.I. Schmidt versus Sekan, a very important observation is whether there is a solicitation or not in violation of the clause is essentially a question of fact. So this was about customers. Merely approaching the customers is not a violation. Giving quotations is also not violation. In order to establish that there is soliciting, orders should have been placed. So merely calling upon, see, this is natural part of business that I want customers, and naturally customers are of some existing businesses. So naturally I would want to attract them. And therefore, unless there is such a clause and I have taken steps and the orders are placed with me, then only the case of solicitation might be made out. The court actually held that the case of solicitation was not made out. So what I wish to stress is that how confidentiality will be protected. One is the in-house policies, the lock and the fence, which I talked about. And the other is a strong confidentiality agreement. And the third is building a culture of maintaining secrets. So I request now Vaishali Madam to take over. Perhaps questions now or later, Kunal, you can decide.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Kunal, do you want to take questions now or should I?
No, when you continue, then we can take them up.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am. I think it was such a comprehensive talk about all the concepts relating to confidentiality, non-compete, and non-solicitation. For all practical purposes, these are now clauses which are faced by lawyers very, very often, since most of the records are electronic in nature, and these clauses suddenly have had a completely new meaning in the last decade, or perhaps more than a decade, where siphoning of information has been easier than it was earlier. And that is why we also see that cases relating to breach of confidentiality, injunction to enforce clauses of confidentiality in agreements, and also criminal cases for data theft, criminal breach of trust have really increased in the last few years. So just to take off from some of the basic principles that you have spoken about,
A minute, Vaishali. Can I stop my sharing?
Yes, because I don't have a presentation, so
yes. Done.
So I want to first talk about what to protect, and then let's look at how to protect it. Most of the times I see, and of course ma'am has taken examples of what is confidential information, how to define it, how it is different from intellectual property, etc. But in practical terms, what I find when I speak to clients, when they come to us for, say, drafting confidentiality agreements, or come to us when there is a breach and loss of data, the connection with confidential information is more emotional than practical. They are so invested in all this data is mine and we need this sort of protection. And sometimes we need to really see through what exactly was required to be protected, how it was protected, so that you don't waste resources, time and money trying to protect anything and everything under the sun, or what is available in your business, because that all of that may not be confidential, all of that may not require protection. Some of the data could be in public domain. So that is the first thing that we need to look at when we look at confidentiality agreements. What is it that is required to be protected? You could also look at, is it required to be protected under law? Then we could come to, when we look at contracts and processes, etc. Is there a statutory obligation on an organization to protect that information? For example, and this has been taken up in the earlier presentation as well, personal and sensitive personal information is required to be protected under Section 43A of the Information Technology Act. And there are certain processes and safeguards corporates need to have in place in order to protect this information, which is classified as confidential information. So any organization dealing with, say, sensitive personal information, which could be financial information or health information. So broadly, if you classify these companies as banks and financial institutions, and let's say hospitals and doctor establishments, these are the people who will have access to sensitive information, which is either financial information or medical information. So without even going into any complex processes that need to be deployed for protection of such information, the law itself says that such organizations need to be 27001 ISO IEC standard compliant. So that is an information security standard that is mandatory for compliance when it comes to organizations like these. And if for non-compliance, if anybody suffers from a non-compliant agency or an organization which results in a loss of data, then the remedy is available again under the Information Technology Act, and compensation up to 5 crores can be demanded for this loss of information. The only problem here is the quantum of loss needs to be proved by the person suffering from the loss. So this is about what could happen when there is a statutory obligation to protect information. The way there is a statutory obligation under 43A, for example, banks have a statutory obligation to protect information under various RBI notifications that govern the banks. If you see how the banking scenario is, the banks have been categorized as level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Depending on the types of online services being offered by the bank. And RBI has very categorically stated that commensurate to the level at which the financial institution is, the certain measures of protection need to be deployed when it comes to protection of data that is handled by these institutions. Now, in order to further simplify this, let me break that down into, say, 3 parts. In order to protect any confidential information that is in your custody, we have to look at 3 things: process, people, and technology. Protection has to happen first through technology. Protection does not happen automatically. The second is, after deployment of technology, people need to be aware how to use the technology. So the people aspect becomes very important when it comes to protection of information. And then what is it that needs to be followed in order to protect the confidential information? And that is where processes and policies come in. Another aspect, this may sound a little haphazard, but I'm going to also give some cases so that we can put all this in perspective. It is also important for companies to see where all this data is going. For example, there is a certain data that the first step was to classify data, whether it is confidential or not. The second is to see who all will have access to the data. Are employees having access to that data? Are you giving the data outside your company, let's say it's getting outsourced for processing, say payroll. Now you'll see most of the companies outsourcing their payroll function completely, which means highly confidential and sensitive employee information is actually going into hands of third parties for processing. So that could be one way in which the data is leaving the company or getting into third party hands. There could be occasions where you are giving outside agencies on-site access. For example, auditors. Auditors are coming on your premises and they are getting visibility of more than what they need to know. Let's take a very specific example of, let's say, software license audit. You will have multiple software licenses being deployed in the organization, and you will get a notice from one of the license providers saying that contractually you have given us a right to audit, so we are going to come on your premises and we are going to use external third-party tools on your system to audit your system. Now that could be a big red flag, because now your confidential information is getting exposed not only to the third party, but we don't even know through the tools that get deployed, where is the data, is there any shadow a copy of that data going to be made? Is that copy being temporary or permanent? Will there be a destruction of that data after the audit is over? And if the auditor, so for example, there is a software license audit for a particular service provider or a OEM, if they get visibility of your unauthorized licenses of some other OEM, are they supposed to use that information? So that is also very important. So when information goes in the hands of third parties and contracts are designed, these are the considerations that become very, very important in terms of what is getting disclosed, how it is getting disclosed, what is the tools and technology that are going to be used for such disclosure, what is going to happen in terms of storage and retention, and then destruction or return of information. All of that needs to be very, very clearly defined when it comes to that contract. And ma'am very rightly pointed out section 37. It talks about how the parties need to perform their obligations. And so section 37 talks about parties need to perform the obligation. How they need to perform the obligation need to be very, very clearly defined in the contract. And the more clarity there is in terms of what exactly parties need to do in terms of process, people, process, and technology, the execution or interpretation of that contract becomes much easier. I have also seen in my practice, most of the confidentiality agreements are template agreements. Clients don't want to spend on reviewing of any confidentiality agreements. It's more like a patchwork where, but those agreements really don't serve any purpose, because there's no thought behind those agreements as to what needs to be protected, how it needs to be protected, and what happens after the purpose of that contract is over. Let's come very specifically to what happens in confidentiality agreements with employees. For employees, access management is perhaps the most important part in a confidentiality agreement. Giving access, what is the sort of access employees have to confidential data in the company? Is it a all level, all blanket access where every employee gets access to everything in the company? Then that is really something to worry about. And that is why access management becomes very important. Which employee has access to what sort of data? And ma'am also mentioned about, let's say, what happens in lawyers' offices. So even in offices where a lot of confidential information is existing, it is very important that within an organization, so the accounts people need to have access to the accounts information, obviously, but an associate or a lawyer working in that organization need not have access to that folder or that directory in an organization. So those are maybe simple tips as to how to do access management. If I have to give you a list of things that an organization needs to look at when it comes to protection of data or confidentiality, we have already included that in the agreement, but now how to spell it out perhaps as an annexure to the agreement. And I made a list of, say, 7 things that a confidentiality agreement needs to have. First and foremost, if the data is being shared with a third party, and if I'm expecting the third party to have a similar method in which the data will be protected based on, of course, the value of data. Now, you can't say, I'm giving you data which is, say, just a customer list, but you follow a security mechanism that is, say, applicable to a bank. So what is reasonable will be very important. If it is decided by contract, the reasonability is decided by contract, then there is less scope of interpretation that may just go haywire. So the reasonability, I always feel, is best to be defined as far as possible and as much as possible within the contract itself. That we expect at least minimum 10 things when it comes to, say, technical compliance when the data is handed over to a third party. The first and foremost could be technical and the organizational measures taken by the third party or the recipient of the confidential information as to what is it that will be the organizational structure in which this data will be handled. So who will have access? What is it going to be used for? Where is it going to be stored? The medium on which it is going to be stored, is it going to be secure? And all of that can be described under the technical and organizational measures. The network management also becomes very, very important, because if that is going to go on the data is going to get circulated on the network, then what is the network condition? Is there a cloud on which the data is stored? Is the cloud based in India, or is your data going to go outside of the geographical indications of the country? That is also a very important aspect that needs to be considered. The third could be secure configuration of devices, and it sounds very simple, but perhaps it's the most easiest way in which data gets lost or stolen or misused when devices are not secure. So that also can be very specifically stated as to what could be the device security. Is it going to be password protected? Is it going to be biometrically protected? Are there any other device security devices or technology that is going to be deployed? For example, say multi-factor authentication. Of course, it all depends on the nature and quality of data that is being shared, and these processes have to be commensurate with or reasonable enough in terms of what data is being shared. User access control is again something that sounds very basic, but that needs to be defined as to what is the access management. Sometimes it's also called access management, change control, password policy, etc. Let me just break the monotony by just giving one or two cases which we found that how this really needs to be addressed when it comes to corporate scenarios. Most of the employees will tend to use their personal email IDs. Most of the data we have seen get lost because, or it gets into hands of unauthorized third parties because of use of personal email accounts in corporate scenarios. So it is very, very important that there is a stated policy as to whether an attachment or a file can be sent on a personal email address or not. And many years back, we had this very interesting case where this lady employee decided to send herself some files on her personal email account because she wanted to work from home, and at that time remote access, VPN, all of that was not available. So she had to work on a different machine at home, and because she had a deadline to meet, and some of the files she had sent to herself. This was her defense, that she wanted to work from home, and that is where she had sent the data. But it so happened that the device on which she had later downloaded that data was the device of her husband, who was the employee of a direct competitor. So these husband and wife were working for two competing companies, large companies, and this company where this lady worked absolutely did not look at it very kindly, and there was actually a criminal complaint filed against her for data theft, because that was not only in violation of a very clear-cut stated policy that personal email accounts are not to be used, and especially when it went on a device which was the device of a direct competitor. So that is why very clear-cut policies and awareness of employees in terms of these policies become very important. Another case we saw was employees also have, especially marketing, sales employees have a habit of forwarding the emails from their official email accounts to their personal email accounts, or even from their personal email accounts to another forwarding email account, so that there could be access from different places. We saw in one case that this forwarding feature that was enabled was not disabled by that employee later on. Neither did the IT department of that organization paid enough attention to these forwards being sent to email addresses outside the organization. And as in when they realized that there was even almost loss of business because that employee was working with that competitor, as ma'am rightly said that Section 27 will directly apply. You can't stop him from working with a competitor. But now we had direct evidence because of all these forwarding emails, all the confidential information was going right into the inbox of the person working with the competitor. And there are several decisions which say that confidential information, valuable information of the former employer cannot be used as a springboard for the employee who has left or the competing employer who has now hired that employee. And you'll find enough decisions relating to this springboard sort of analysis of how non-compete agreements and confidentiality agreements work. When it comes to standards that need to be followed, there are several standards available when it comes to cybersecurity, and ISO 27001 is the most common. But you will also have SAS 70 type 1, type 2. You'll also have PCI DSS when it comes to payment card information that is companies have access to. And as I said, for banking, there is RBI and NPCI guidelines on cybersecurity that the organizations need to adhere to and comply with. There are penalties which have been stated under the respective legislations when there is loss of data. And just one more point which I perhaps forgot in mentioning in the list is to have an appropriate data leak prevention strategy and also an incident management response. For example, let's say ransomware, something that is so common, and ransomware is typically when first the data does go in the hands of a third party and then there is encryption. So you have already lost the data. So what happens in a scenario like this, and do you have an incident management response system? Do you have an appropriate backup? Are you ready to pay the ransom? Do you want to go to the police, etc.? Is something that needs to be thought of even before, of course, a ransomware attack happens. And maybe one more point that generally goes unnoticed when it comes to sharing of data is subcontracting, because the party with which you are going to share data, you have to be absolutely sure that there is no subcontracting of the services. And if there is, then the reasonable measures of security that you expect from the contracting party, the same level of security needs to be deployed by the subcontractor, and that flow in the contract needs to be maintained properly. I'm not sure whether I've covered all aspects of people, process, technology, but yeah, that's what I have wanted to add in this session. I know we've really overshot the time, so over to you, Kunal, if we have any questions.
So actually, I myself had a few questions. So this is a question for both Bhatbade ma'am and Vaishali ma'am. That considering that we have GDPR which applies to personal data, do you feel that instead of leaving the confidentiality of information to contract lawyers or people who are drafting the contract, and then there may in which case there would arise issues with respect to the language of the contract, has the time probably come for a Data Protection Act with respect to trade related data as well?
So I think ma'am, you want to take it first?
Can you see me? But
yes.
Kunal, please allow unmuting on N Bhatbade.
I'll just check.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yes, there is always a need for this data protection law, And but whatever the law, I think taking care oneself and having strong agreements is always essential.
Yes, ma'am. And I think ma'am had already mentioned that there is a law, but putting a fence around your property is something that you require to do irrespective of the law. The law protects protects your possession, but you also need to proactively do something to protect your possession, and that's exactly what we do with confidentiality agreements. And describing confidential information properly, describing processes to protect the confidential information in the agreements gives better clarity to both parties. For example, ma'am also showed one example which said that confidential information which is oral in nature, it is suicidal to say yes to a contract like this if you're a recipient, because then everything can come between, oh, I had orally disclosed this information, and it's very difficult for everybody, for even adjudicating officers or judges to really interpret whether this had happened or not. And then you have to rely on circumstantial evidence and other forms of evidence to prove that the information was really disclosed. So having a tight confidentiality agreement definitely serves the purpose, irrespective of however good laws you have on data protection. When it comes to GDPR, I think when it comes to GDPR, it is very specific for data of European nationals being processed outside the country, and those countries need to be GDPR compliant, or any other law which talks of cross-border sharing of personal information. It could be the CCPA, or there are so many other countries now having their own legislations. Earlier, it was called Safe Harbor, where data was sent to countries not having adequate data protection laws. And that is where Safe Harbor regulations came in, which got translated into a more robust legislation like GDPR now.
And the way you described, Vaishali, it is not just necessary that I must have a fence, but if you are the receiver of information, I must also find out what fence you have.
That's, yes, absolutely.
Right? So probably ask questions, or probably state that this is the security which I would require you to have. So it is necessary for the giver to find out the processes in the receiver's system as well.
So I'll just give one example of what you just said. When generally banks outsource their processing activities, and there is a vendor management process that we follow, and whether the vendor has adequate security. So the vendor, generally, or the service provider, generally, they put in the clause that we have our own information security policy that we will adhere to. And
Right.
and sometimes you say, no, but that's not enough. Either you show us what the policy is, or the wordings need to be changed to say you have to adhere to an information security policy, which is that of the bank and not what it is of yours.
Right.
And of course, there's a lot of negotiation that happens on it. But yeah, that's it. I think that's just to give you a practical example of what you just said.
A negotiation about fences.
Yes.
Where should it be put? Yeah.
Thank
I
you,
think there
ma'am.
is a question on chat.
Yes, ma'am. So I'll just read it out. In most of the employment contracts in India, garden leave clauses are still not considered as relevant as in other common law jurisdictions. However, when we talk about non-compete clauses, garden leave clauses, in my opinion, become very relevant. If the honorable speakers could shed some light on garden leave in the context of garden leave clauses in Indian context, it would be very helpful.
I think garden leave clauses are struck down as violative of, let me just see the case, in VFS Global Services, right? The Bombay High Court has opined that garden leave clauses violate Section 27 because they operate as post-contract restrictions.
Right.
There is no harm in having clauses. They might have a psychological effect.
Right.
But there is every chance that if it is violated and the matter goes to court, in the way the Bombay High Court has interpreted it, it might be struck down as void. I mean, this is an area where you keep saying it might happen, it might happen,
Right.
it might happen that way. Yeah.
So ma'am, actually, like one real life example that I've also seen, like one of the firms where I was working, they had a clause that for 3 years, there was a lock-in clause for 3 years, and the justification for the same was that, when we take you in as a fresher, we invest substantial time. So this was specifically for freshers, and the purpose or logic was that we invest substantial time in, ensuring that you come up to a particular standard. So then we deserve to hold on to you for another 2 years. So would that fall within, the scope of a non-compete, or would that also be something violative of Section 27? If you could just throw some light on that.
I believe that you cannot stop anyone from ending the contract, especially employment.
Right.
If the person doesn't come to work, he doesn't come to work.
Right.
Right. And there are a few cases, I will have to go through 1 or 2 cases. But anyway, if it is only a question of training and expenses on training, then a good liquidated damages clause should be able to cover it. That if it is 5 years, the ideal thing is to have liquidated damages clause, which is linked with the number of years he has not served, so that it will appear reasonable.
Understood. Right.
So instead of having 2 lakh, whatever time you leave, perhaps it can say 20,000 for each year that you have not served with the company.
Right. Yes, thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, I think with that, we can come to the end of our session. So, Vaishali ma'am, if you have anything to say, then I'll continue.
I'm just very glad that ma'am could come to the study circle session, and we were really looking forward to this session, ma'am, from you. And of course, we're going to trouble you one more time for the specific relief act discussion from you, and we'll come back to you with a date which is convenient to you, and we'll announce that lecture soon. Thank you very much for participating. I can also see Mr. Shintre Dad has joined, and if he wants to say something, he was also looking forward to attending today's session. I'm not sure whether तू त्यांना unmute केलेलं आहेस का पुन्हा?
I asked to unmute at this press.
Okay, all right. So again, anyway, so thank you very much, ma'am, and look forward to your association with the study circle. And please give whatever suggestions you feel you have for us to improve, or topics that you think are more suitable for young lawyers, and we'll definitely take it up. I hope you've enjoyed this session with us.
Yes. So thank you very much. You mentioned, Kunal, about not Kunal, in the introduction, about the study circle which Shintre sir and Bendre sir had started. And it was at such a time where I used to participate as sometimes as a speaker, introducer, and sometimes as a person listening in those study circles. So I remember those days. But then you mentioned that I have joined, and I'm very happy to join. What does a lecturer need? A willing audience, right? So it's a pleasure always. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. So, ma'am, actually, thank you for, initially we also weren't sure, as to if there might be some sort of an overlap between what was covered in part 1 and part 2. But it has been explained so beautifully by you that, once part 1 gave us an idea as to what exactly are these clauses. And when it came to actual drafting of these clauses from a contract law perspective, I think this session has really helped us all, including the audiences. And thank you so much, ma'am. And we look forward to having you again. And thank you, Vaishali ma'am, as well.
Thank you.
Also, I would also request everyone in the audience to, both Vaishali ma'am and Nilip Badbade ma'am, they are part of the WhatsApp study circle group. So you may also put in your feedback on the WhatsApp study circle group. And if there are any new participants, I would request you to provide your phone number, and we can add you to the WhatsApp. So with that, thank you, Nilima ma'am, and thank you, Vaishali ma'am, for this very insightful and enlightening session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.